Emma Martinez adjusted her polo shirt one more time before stepping out of her Honda Civic. The familiar scent of charcoal and barbecue sauce drifted across the suburban street, mixing with the sound of children splashing in backyard pools and classic rock playing from portable speakers. Memorial Day weekend in Riverside always felt the same, hot, loud, and heavy, with the weight of family expectations she could never quite meet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She grabbed the store-bought potato salad from her passenger seat, knowing full well that Aunt Linda would comment on how she never had time to make anything homemade anymore. The truth was, Emma rarely had time for anything that resembled a normal life. Most people her age were posting Instagram photos of weekend brunches and dating apps. Emma spent her weekends reviewing classified intelligence reports and coordinating operations that most Americans would never know existed. The Martinez family barbecue was an annual tradition that felt more like a military parade than a family gathering. Her father Bob had started hosting these Memorial Day events 15 years ago, turning their backyard into a shrine of American flags, vintage Army photographs, and war memorabilia that he displayed like trophies. Every year, the same cast of characters would gather around the same folding tables, drinking the same beer, and listening to the same stories about the good old days when men were men and wars were worth fighting. Emma paused at the side gate, hearing her father's booming voice carry across the yard. He was already 3 beers in, judging by the volume and the way his words carried that familiar edge of authority mixed with nostalgia. Bob Martinez had never fully left the Army, even though the Army had left him 5 years ago. At 58, he still woke up at 0500, still pressed his civilian clothes with military precision, and still expected everyone around him to fall in line like good soldiers. The backyard was exactly as Emma had expected. Red, white, and blue streamers hung from the covered patio, fluttering in the afternoon breeze. A massive American flag dominated one corner, while smaller flags marked the perimeter like territorial boundaries. Bob had set up his usual display of framed photographs near the grill. Pictures of himself in dress uniform, group shots from various deployments, and certificates of commendation that he'd somehow managed to make the centerpiece of every family gathering for the past decade. Uncle Tommy was holding court near the cooler, gesturing wildly with a beer bottle as he recounted some embellished tale from his construction job. Aunt Linda bustled between the kitchen and patio, carrying trays of food and shooting apologetic glances at anyone who made eye contact. The neighbors Frank and Margaret had claimed their usual spots at the picnic table closest to the grill, where they could hear every word Bob said without having to move. And there, standing next to Bob like a poster child for military excellence, was her cousin Jake. 28 years old, fresh-faced, and wearing his marine dress blues despite the 90-degree heat. Jake had graduated from basic training 8 months ago and somehow managed to turn every family conversation into a recruitment commercial. He stood with perfect posture, his chest puffed out just enough to display his ribbons, nodding along as Bob explained the finer points of military strategy to anyone within earshot. Emma knew she was being unfair. Jake was a good kid who'd found his calling in the Marines, but watching him bask in Bob's approval while she remained perpetually invisible felt like swallowing glass. She'd spent the last decade building a career that required more strategic thinking, more leadership, and more courage than Jake had ever been asked to demonstrate. The difference was that her work came with security clearances instead of ribbons, and success measured in lives saved rather than medals earned. She pushed through the gate, and immediately felt the familiar weight of scrutiny. Bob's eyes found her first, scanning her appearance with the same critical assessment he'd used when she was 12, and forgot to make her bed. The polo shirt and khakis that served as her weekend uniform suddenly felt inadequate, like showing up to a formal dinner in pajamas. "There she is," Bob announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for disappointments disguised as introductions. "My daughter Emma, fresh from another thrilling week behind a desk." The comment landed exactly as intended. Uncle Tommy chuckled into his beer. Frank nodded knowingly, as if Bob had just confirmed something they'd all been thinking. Even Jake smiled, though his expression held more pity than malice. They saw exactly what Bob wanted them to see. A 32-year-old woman who'd chosen the safe path, the easy route, the kind of meaningless office job that contributed nothing to society. Emma had heard variations of this introduction for years. Sometimes Bob called her work paper pushing. Other times it was government bureaucracy at its finest. Once, memorably, he'd referred to her as living proof that not everyone in the family inherited the courage gene. Each comment was delivered with a smile, packaged as good-natured ribbing between father and daughter. But Emma knew better. Bob wasn't joking. He was making a point. The truth was that Emma worked as a senior intelligence analyst for a joint task force that most people believed existed only in Hollywood movies. Her desk job involved coordinating operations across 3 continents, managing assets in hostile territories, and making decisions that affected national security. She held security clearances that took her 3 years to obtain and had briefed senators, generals, and cabinet members on threats that could destabilize entire regions. But none of that mattered in Bob's backyard. Here, surrounded by flags and photographs and the mythology of military service, Emma was just another civilian who'd chosen comfort over contribution. She was the daughter who'd disappointed him by pursuing education instead of enlistment, intelligence instead of infantry, strategy instead of the simple clarity of following orders. Emma set the potato salad on the nearest table and accepted a beer from Uncle Tommy, who squeezed her shoulder with the kind of affection reserved for family members you love but don't quite understand. She'd learned years ago not to defend herself, not to explain, not to try to bridge the gap between who she was and who Bob wanted her to be. It was easier to smile, nod, and count the hours until she could escape back to her real life. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, creating shimmering heat waves above the concrete patio. Emma found a spot in the shade near Aunt Linda, who was arranging chips and dip with the precision of someone who'd been managing Bob's social events for decades. Linda shot her a sympathetic look, the kind of silent communication that passed between women who'd learned to navigate difficult men. Around them, the party continued its predictable rhythm. Bob grilled burgers with military precision, flipping each patty at exactly the right moment while delivering a running commentary on proper cooking techniques. Frank and Margaret nodded along to his stories about overseas deployments, adding their own war stories from their son's service. Jake stood at attention even while relaxing, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his posture perfect even while drinking beer. Emma sipped her drink and watched the performance, feeling like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. She understood the appeal of military structure, the comfort of clear hierarchies and defined missions. Her own work operated within similar frameworks, though the enemy was often invisible and the victories rarely celebrated. But here, in this backyard theater, military service was transformed into something larger than life, something sacred and untouchable. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Bob and his friends reminisced about battles fought decades ago, Emma was actively engaged in protecting the country they claimed to love. While Jake polished his ribbons and practiced his salutes, Emma was coordinating operations that kept Americans safe from threats they'd never know existed. But none of that translated into the language Bob understood, the language of uniforms and ceremonies and public recognition. As the afternoon wore on, Emma settled into her familiar role as the family's quiet disappointment, the daughter who'd chosen safety over service, comfort over courage. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at Uncle Tommy's jokes, and pretended not to notice the way conversations shifted when she approached. It was a performance she'd perfected over years of family gatherings, a survival mechanism that kept the peace while protecting what little remained of her relationship with her father. But today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the heat, or the beer, or the way Jake kept glancing at her with something that looked like pity. Maybe it was the cumulative weight of years spent being dismissed, underestimated, and relegated to the margins of her own family. Or maybe it was simply time for the truth to surface, whether she was ready for it or not. The trouble started when Bob decided to show off his latest acquisition. He disappeared into the garage and emerged carrying a wooden display case, the kind used for military honors and ceremonial items. Inside, nestled on red velvet, lay an ornate ceremonial sword with an engraved brass nameplate that caught the afternoon sun. Bob set the case on the picnic table, with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Picked this beauty up at an estate sale last week," Bob announced, his chest swelling with pride. "Belonged to a World War II colonel. Real American hero, not like these desk jockeys we've got running things nowadays." Emma felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the way her breathing always shifted when Bob started one of his speeches. She'd learned to recognize the signs over the years. The slight increase in volume, the way his gestures became more theatrical, the careful selection of words designed to land like precision strikes. This wasn't casual conversation. This was Bob building towards something. Uncle Tommy leaned over the display case, whistling appreciatively. "That's some serious hardware, Bob. Bet it's got some stories to tell." "You got that right," Bob replied, lifting the sword carefully from its case. The blade gleamed despite its age, and the weight of it seemed to transform Bob's entire posture. He held it like he was born to carry weapons, like the steel itself recognized his authority. This belonged to Colonel Harrison Mitchell, Silver Star recipient, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device. Now that was a man who understood what real service looks like. Frank nodded sagely from his lawn chair, beer balanced on his expanding belly. "Those were different times, Bob. Men knew their duty back then. None of this sitting around in air-conditioned offices, typing reports all day." Emma caught the deliberate emphasis on typing reports and realized where this conversation was heading. Bob wasn't just showing off his new purchase. He was setting the stage for another one of his lectures about real work versus make-believe careers. She considered excusing herself to help Aunt Linda in the kitchen, but something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe she was finally tired of running from these moments. Jake stepped closer to examine the sword, his Marine training evident in the respectful way he positioned himself. "The craftsmanship is incredible, Uncle Bob. They don't make them like this anymore." "Damn right they don't," Bob said, his voice gaining momentum. "Everything's different now. Soft. Comfortable. We've got a whole generation that thinks clicking buttons on a computer screen is the same as putting your life on the line for your country." The comment hung in the air like smoke from the barbecue, acrid and impossible to ignore. Emma felt every eye in the backyard turn toward her. Some curious, others sympathetic, all waiting to see how she'd respond. She took a long sip of her beer and said nothing, which only seemed to encourage Bob's momentum. "Don't get me wrong," Bob continued, his voice taking on that false reasonableness that always preceded his most cutting observations. "I'm sure Emma's very good at whatever it is she does in that office. Filing reports, scheduling meetings, making sure the coffee machine gets refilled. Important stuff." Uncle Tommy chuckled, the sound harsh in the afternoon heat. "Come on, Bob. I'm sure it's more complicated than that." "Is it, though?" Bob asked, genuine curiosity creeping into his voice, as if he'd never actually considered what Emma's work might involve. "I mean, how hard can it be? Show up at 9, leave at 5, 2 weeks paid vacation, health insurance, retirement plan. Sounds like a pretty sweet deal to me." Margaret, who'd been quietly nursing her wine spritzer, finally spoke up. "Now, Bob, not everyone can be in the military. Someone's got to do the regular jobs, too." "Regular jobs?" Bob repeated, as if testing the words for flavor. "Right. Regular jobs for regular people. Nothing wrong with that, I suppose. Can't all be heroes." The word heroes landed like a physical blow. Emma felt her jaw clench involuntarily, her fingers tightening around the beer bottle. She'd been called many things in her career: brilliant, ruthless, essential, dangerous, but never regular. The irony was so complete it was almost funny. Here was Bob, holding a dead man's sword and talking about heroism, while his daughter sat 3 feet away, having personally prevented 2 international incidents in the past month alone. Linda emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh corn on the cob, her timing impeccable as always. "Bob, honey, why don't you put that sword away before someone gets hurt? You know how clumsy Tommy gets when he's been drinking." "Hey now," Tommy protested, but he was smiling. The momentary distraction gave everyone a chance to reset, to pretend that the conversation hadn't taken its familiar turn toward Emma's professional inadequacy. But Bob wasn't finished. He carefully placed the sword back in its case, but his eyes remained fixed on Emma with the intensity of a predator who'd caught scent of weakness. "You know what I was thinking about the other day, Em? Remember when you were little, and you used to play with those toy soldiers? You'd set up these elaborate battle scenes, complete with strategy and tactics. I thought for sure you'd end up in the military. Emma remembered those afternoons vividly. She'd spent hours arranging plastic figures, creating complex scenarios that involved supply lines, communication networks, and strategic positioning. But what Bob remembered as child's play had actually been Emma's first introduction to operational thinking. Those toy battles had taught her to see patterns, to anticipate enemy movements, to understand that victory often depended more on information than firepower. "I was 8 years old, Dad," Emma said quietly. "Kids play with lots of things they don't end up doing professionally." "True enough," Bob agreed, but there was something calculating in his expression. "Still, it makes you wonder what might have been different if you'd chosen a different path." "Jake here understood the calling. Didn't you, Jake?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to be drawn into whatever point Bob was building toward. "Uncle Bob, everyone serves in their own way." "Do they, though?" Bob asked, his voice carrying the weight of genuine philosophical inquiry mixed with practiced condescension. "I mean, is sitting in a climate-controlled office really the same as putting your life on the line? Is analyzing spreadsheets really the same as defending freedom?" The questions weren't directed at Jake, they were aimed squarely at Emma, delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning this conversation for weeks. Bob had always been tactical in his approach to family dynamics, understanding exactly how to apply pressure at the most vulnerable points. He knew that Emma's greatest weakness was her inability to defend herself without revealing information that could endanger national security. Frank, sensing the shift in energy, leaned forward in his chair. "Bob's got a point, you know. There's something to be said for honest work, for putting yourself in harm's way. Takes a special kind of person." "Exactly," Bob said, warming to his theme. "It's about sacrifice. It's about understanding that some things are more important than your own comfort, your own safety. It's about being willing to bleed for something bigger than yourself." Emma felt the familiar burning sensation behind her eyes, the one that always preceded tears she refused to shed. She'd bled for her country in ways Bob couldn't imagine. Not literally, though there'd been close calls in Kandahar and Damascus that still woke her up some nights. But she'd sacrificed relationships, normalcy, the simple pleasure of living without constantly looking over her shoulder. She'd given up the luxury of ignorance, the comfort of believing that the world was safer than it actually was. But none of that translated into the language of barbecue politics. None of it fit into Bob's narrow definition of service, which required uniforms and ceremonies and public recognition. Emma's victories were classified, her failures buried in files that would remain sealed for decades. She couldn't point to ribbons or medals or photographs of herself shaking hands with generals. All she had was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her work mattered, even if her own father would never understand how much. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the patio. Children's voices carried from neighboring yards, mixing with the distant sound of traffic and lawnmowers. The normalcy of it all felt surreal against the backdrop of Bob's systematic dismantling of Emma's professional identity. She wondered what he'd say if he knew that just last Tuesday she'd coordinated a joint operation that prevented a terrorist cell from acquiring weapons-grade plutonium. Would that qualify as real service in his book? Or would he find some way to diminish it because it hadn't required her to crawl through mud or sleep in a foxhole? Bob closed the display case with ceremonial precision, the snap of the latches punctuating his unspoken point. The sword was safely secured, a relic of authentic heroism protected from the corrupting influence of modern mediocrity. Emma understood the symbolism perfectly. In Bob's world, there were warriors and civilians, heroes and paper pushers, people who mattered and people who filled space. And she, despite everything she'd accomplished, remained firmly in the second category. The moment arrived with the casual cruelty that family gatherings seemed to specialize in. Bob had just finished explaining the proper way to grill a burger to Frank, who nodded along despite having operated his own backyard barbecue for 20 years. The conversation had moved on to neighborhood politics, then to the sorry state of local schools, before inevitably circling back to Bob's favorite topic, the decline of American work ethic. "You know what the problem is with kids today?" Bob announced, flipping a burger with unnecessary force. "They don't understand the value of real work. Everything's got to be easy, comfortable, safe. Nobody wants to get their hands dirty anymore." Jake, still standing at parade rest despite the informal setting, nodded dutifully. The Marines definitely teach you the value of hard work, Uncle Bob. Exactly my point, Bob said, brandishing his spatula like a weapon. The military knows how to separate the wheat from the chaff, put people through real challenges, real tests. Not like these cushy government jobs where you get a pension just for showing up. Emma felt the familiar weight of collective attention settling on her shoulders. She'd been hoping the conversation would drift towards safer territory, maybe Uncle Tommy's latest construction project, or Aunt Linda's garden. But Bob had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was building towards something specific. She recognized the signs from years of being his favorite target. Speaking of cushy government jobs, Bob continued, his voice carrying across the backyard with practiced projection, Emma here's got it pretty good, don't you, sweetheart? Regular hours. Good benefits, job security. Must be nice not having to worry about anything more dangerous than a paper cut. The comment drew chuckles from Frank and Uncle Tommy, the kind of automatic laughter that follows any statement from the person controlling the grill. Emma managed a tight smile, the expression she'd perfected for moments like these. It conveyed good humor while revealing nothing, a diplomatic response that neither escalated nor retreated. But Bob wasn't satisfied with polite deflection. He'd been drinking since noon, and the combination of alcohol and audience had activated his need to establish dominance. I mean, what's the most stressful part of your day, Em? Deciding whether to use Times New Roman or Arial font. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her lawn chair, her maternal instincts apparently recognizing that Bob was crossing from gentle teasing into something meaner. Bob, honey, maybe we should. No, it's fine, Bob interrupted, his voice gaining the false joviality that always preceded his cruelest observations. Emma knows I'm just kidding around. She's got thick skin, don't you, Em? Has to, working in government. Probably deals with difficult people all day. The irony was so complete that Emma almost laughed, despite herself. She did indeed deal with difficult people all day, though they were more likely to be arms dealers, terrorist financiers, and rogue state actors than upset taxpayers filing complaints. Her last performance review had specifically noted her ability to remain calm under pressure, a skill she'd developed through years of managing international crises that could spiral into armed conflicts with a single miscommunication. Jake cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Uncle Bob, I'm sure Emma's job is more complicated than it looks. Oh, I'm sure it is, Bob agreed, his tone suggesting the opposite. Lots of forms to fill out, I bet. Meetings to attend. PowerPoint presentations to sit through. Real brain-busting stuff. Emma took a slow sip of her beer, using the motion to buy herself a moment of composure. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only provided Bob with more ammunition. The best strategy was to remain silent, let him exhaust his need to diminish her, and wait for the conversation to move on. But today felt different. Maybe it was the heat, or the way Jake kept glancing at her with something that looked dangerously close to pity. You know what I was thinking about the other day? Bob continued, apparently interpreting Emma's silence as permission to escalate. Remember when you were in college, and you used to talk about changing the world? Making a difference? Big dreams, big plans. And now? He gestured vaguely in Emma's direction, as if her current existence spoke for itself. The gesture was small, almost dismissive, but it carried the weight of 20 years of accumulated disappointment. In Bob's mind, Emma represented everything wrong with her generation. The choice of comfort over courage, security over significance, the easy path over the right one. Now she's got a steady paycheck and a nice retirement plan, Aunt Linda interjected, her voice carrying a note of warning that Bob chose to ignore. Nothing wrong with that. Course not, Bob agreed quickly, though his expression suggested otherwise. Stability's important. Can't all be out there making history, right? Someone's got to handle the paperwork. The word paperwork landed like a slap. Emma's jaw tightened involuntarily, her fingers gripping the beer bottle with enough force to leave indentations. She thought about the reports she'd written in the past month alone, threat assessments that had influenced foreign policy decisions, operational summaries that had been briefed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, intelligence analyses that had prevented 3 separate international incidents from escalating into armed conflicts. But Bob saw only what he wanted to see. His daughter, the disappointment, who'd chosen a safe desk job over meaningful service. He couldn't know that Emma's paperwork included coordinating with CIA operatives in hostile territories, managing intelligence assets across 4 continents, and making split-second decisions that affected global security. Her reports weren't filed in dusty cabinets. They were classified at levels that required presidential authorization to access. Frank leaned forward in his chair, apparently emboldened by Bob's example. You know, Bob, maybe Emma could learn something from Jake here. Military service really builds character, teaches you what real responsibility looks like. Absolutely, Bob said, seizing on the suggestion with obvious enthusiasm. Jake understands what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. Don't you, Jake? Jake's discomfort was visible now, his military bearing unable to hide his desire to be anywhere else. Uncle Bob, everyone serves in different ways. Do they, though? Bob asked, his voice carrying genuine philosophical curiosity mixed with practiced condescension. I mean, is processing forms really the same as defending freedom? Is sitting in meetings really the same as putting your life on the line for your country? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Emma felt the familiar burning sensation behind her eyes, the one that always preceded tears she refused to shed. She'd put her life on the line more times than Bob would ever know. The difference was that her risks were calculated, strategic, invisible to everyone except the people who'd sworn oaths to never speak of what they'd witnessed. Uncle Tommy, perhaps sensing that the conversation had gone too far, attempted to redirect. Hey, Bob, remember that time in Panama when you... Actually, Bob interrupted, his attention still fixed on Emma with laser-like focus. I've been wondering something, Em. What exactly do you do all day? I mean specifically, because when people ask me what my daughter does for a living, I honestly don't know what to tell them. The admission carried unexpected weight. Emma realized that Bob's constant diminishment of her career wasn't just cruel, it was also confused. He genuinely didn't understand what she did, and his confusion had calcified over the years into contempt. In his mind, anything he couldn't understand or categorize must be insignificant. I analyze data, Emma said quietly, offering the same vague description she used with everyone who didn't have security clearance. Risk assessment, threat evaluation, strategic planning. Threat evaluation, Bob repeated, as if testing the words for authenticity. What kind of threats? Angry customers? Budget shortfalls? Office supply shortages? The laughter that followed was automatic, reflexive, the kind that fills uncomfortable silences at family gatherings. But Emma heard something else underneath it. Genuine curiosity mixed with dismissal. Bob wasn't just mocking her. He was also trying to understand how someone could build a career around what he perceived as make-believe dangers. Margaret attempted another rescue. I'm sure it's very important work, Emma. The government needs all kinds of people. Oh, I'm sure it is important, Bob agreed, his tone suggesting the opposite. Essential, even. Can't have the filing system falling apart, can we? Chaos would reign. The sarcasm was sharp enough to cut glass. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with beer or heat or family dynamics. For the first time in her adult life, she found herself genuinely angry at her father. Not hurt, not frustrated, not disappointed, but angry. The emotion felt foreign and dangerous, like handling explosives without proper training. Because the truth was that Emma did prevent chaos from reigning. Just last month, she'd identified a pattern in financial transactions that had led to the disruption of a terrorist network planning attacks on 3 major American cities. 2 weeks ago, her analysis of satellite intelligence had prevented an international incident that could have destabilized an entire region. Yesterday, she'd briefed the Secretary of Defense on threats that most Americans couldn't imagine in their darkest nightmares. But none of that fit into Bob's narrow definition of meaningful work. None of it translated into the language of uniforms and medals and public ceremonies. Emma's victories were classified, her failures buried in files that would remain sealed for decades. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She couldn't point to ribbons or commendations or photographs of herself shaking hands with dignitaries. All she had was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her work mattered, even if her own father would never understand how much. Emma excused herself quietly, slipping away from the patio with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected over years of family gatherings. No one seemed to notice her departure, which was exactly how she preferred it. The kitchen offered temporary sanctuary, its air conditioning a welcome relief from both the physical heat outside and the emotional temperature that had been steadily rising around the barbecue. She stood at the sink, ostensibly helping Aunt Linda with the dishes but really just needing a moment to recalibrate. The cool water running over her hands helped ground her. A simple physical sensation that pulled her back from the edge of saying something she'd regret. Through the window, she could see Bob holding court on the patio, his gestures becoming more animated as he launched into another story about military precision and civilian incompetence. "You okay, honey?" Linda asked softly, her voice carrying the kind of maternal concern that transcended blood relations. She'd been Bob's sister-in-law for 15 years, long enough to recognize the signs of his verbal campaigns and their effect on his targets. "I'm fine," Emma replied automatically, the response she'd trained herself to give whenever anyone showed concern about her relationship with her father. It was easier than explaining the complex web of love, frustration, and disappointment that characterized their interactions. Linda dried a serving bowl with methodical care, her movements slow and deliberate. "He doesn't mean it the way it sounds, you know. He's just proud of Jake, and sometimes that comes out wrong." Emma appreciated the attempt at peacemaking, but they both knew the truth was more complicated. Bob's treatment of Emma wasn't collateral damage from his pride in Jake. It was a deliberate choice to elevate one family member by diminishing another. It was a pattern that had started when Emma chose college over military service and had only intensified over the years. "I know," Emma said anyway, because Linda was trying to help and didn't deserve to be pulled into the emotional crossfire. "It's just family dynamics. Nothing I can't handle." Through the window, she watched Jake shift uncomfortably as Bob launched into a detailed comparison between military training and civilian education. Even Jake seemed to recognize that he was being used as a weapon in someone else's war, though he was too young and too polite to extract himself from the situation gracefully. Emma's phone buzzed against her hip, the familiar vibration pattern that indicated a secure message. She glanced at the screen discreetly, noting the sender's encryption code and the urgent priority flag. Her pulse quickened as she read the brief message. "Situation developing. Need immediate assessment. Conference call in 30 minutes." The timing was perfect and terrible simultaneously. Part of her was relieved to have an excuse to leave early, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of manufactured family harmony. But another part recognized the cruel irony of being summoned to handle a genuine crisis while her father ridiculed her for having a meaningless desk job. "I might need to step out for a work call," Emma told Linda, who nodded with understanding. "Of course, dear. You do what you need to do." Emma pocketed her phone and returned to the patio, where Bob had moved on to explaining the superiority of military logistics to anyone within earshot. Frank nodded along enthusiastically, as if Bob's expertise in moving supplies across hostile terrain somehow qualified him to critique every other form of organizational management. "The problem with civilian operations," Bob was saying, "is they don't understand the importance of clear command structures. Too much democracy, not enough discipline. Everyone wants to have their opinion heard, instead of just following orders and getting the job done." Emma settled back into her chair, noting how the conversation had evolved in her brief absence. Bob had shifted from personal attacks on her career to broader philosophical statements about civilian inadequacy. It was a familiar progression, one that allowed him to make sweeping generalizations while maintaining plausible deniability about targeting anyone specifically. Uncle Tommy raised his beer in a mock toast. "Here's to people who know how to take orders and get things done." "Exactly," Bob agreed. his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose worldview had been validated by his audience. None of this endless discussion and analysis paralysis. Just clear objectives, defined roles, and the discipline to execute. Emma almost laughed at the irony. Her work involved more complex decision-making in a single day than Bob had encountered in his entire military career. While he'd followed orders and implemented strategies designed by others, she developed those strategies. While he'd executed plans created by people with higher security clearances, she was one of the people creating the plans. But the fundamental difference between their experiences went deeper than rank or responsibility. Bob's service had been linear, predictable, bound by clear protocols and established hierarchies. Emma's work existed in the gray spaces between nations, in the ambiguous territories where traditional military thinking became not just inadequate but dangerous. Margaret attempted to steer the conversation towards safer ground. "Bob, didn't you say your neighbor got a promotion at the bank? That's nice, steady work too." "Oh, sure," Bob replied, though his tone suggested that banking fell into the same category as Emma's government position. Necessary, but uninspiring. Good for him. Regular hours, decent pay, nothing too demanding. Some people are built for that kind of work. The phrase, "some people," carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Emma understood that she was being categorized again, filed away in Bob's mental taxonomy under, quote, "people who take the easy path." It was a characterization that would have been laughable if it weren't so consistently painful. Jake cleared his throat, apparently recognizing that the conversation was heading toward dangerous territory again. "Uncle Bob, maybe we should talk about something else. How's your golf game been?" "Golf's fine," Bob said dismissively, clearly reluctant to abandon his favorite topic. "Though speaking of games, Emma, do you ever miss having real challenges at work? I mean, doesn't it get boring after a while, doing the same routine stuff day after day?" The question was phrased as innocent curiosity, but Emma recognized the trap. Any answer she gave would be used as evidence for Bob's predetermined conclusion about her professional limitations. If she claimed to be challenged, he'd point out that real challenges required real risks. If she admitted to routine elements in her work, he'd use that as proof of her mediocrity. "Every job has its routine aspects," Emma said carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing while avoiding obvious defensiveness. "True enough," Bob agreed, though his expression suggested he'd interpreted her diplomatic response as confirmation of his suspicions. "Guess we can't all have exciting careers, right? Someone's got to handle the mundane stuff." The word mundane hit like a physical blow. Emma's jaw tightened involuntarily as she thought about the previous week's crisis, when her analysis of intercepted communications had prevented what intelligence agencies later described as a potential catastrophic event. The 48 hours she'd spent coordinating responses across multiple time zones, managing conflicting information sources, and briefing senior officials had been anything but mundane. Frank leaned back in his chair, apparently inspired by Bob's example to share his own wisdom. "You know what I think the problem is? Kids today don't understand that meaningful work requires sacrifice. They want comfort and security instead of purpose." "Absolutely," Bob said, seizing on the theme with obvious enthusiasm. "Real purpose comes from serving something bigger than yourself, from being willing to put your life on the line for principles that matter." Emma felt her phone buzz again, another encrypted message with an even higher priority rating. She glanced at the preview text and felt her stomach tighten. The situation that had been developing was accelerating, moving from potential crisis toward active threat status. In 30 minutes, she'd be briefing a joint task force on intelligence that could affect global security decisions. But here, surrounded by red, white, and blue decorations and the smell of charcoal, she remained just Emma the disappointment, Emma the paper pusher, Emma who'd chosen comfort over courage and security over sacrifice. The cognitive dissonance was becoming almost unbearable, like trying to exist in two completely different realities simultaneously. "I think purpose means different things to different people," Aunt Linda offered diplomatically, though her voice lacked conviction. She was trying to maintain family harmony while recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond gentle disagreement into something more corrosive. "Does it, though?" Bob asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I mean, there's a difference between real contribution and just going through the motions. Between actually making a difference and just collecting a paycheck. The implication was clear, even if unspoken. Emma represented everything Bob despised about modern American work culture. The prioritization of personal comfort over national service, the choice of safe mediocrity over meaningful risk. In his mind, she'd had every opportunity to follow a path of genuine significance, and had instead chosen the easy route of government bureaucracy. Emma's phone buzzed a third time, the vibration pattern indicating an immediate response was required. She glanced at the message and realized that her window for leaving gracefully was rapidly closing. In 15 minutes, she needed to be in a secure location with encrypted communications capability, ready to help coordinate an international response to a developing threat. The irony was so complete it was almost surreal. While Bob pontificated about the difference between real service and meaningless work, Emma was being summoned to handle exactly the kind of situation he claimed to value: high-stakes decision-making that could affect national security and global stability. But she couldn't explain any of that without violating security protocols that carried criminal penalties. She couldn't defend herself without revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger assets in the field. She was trapped by the very secrecy that made her work possible, forced to accept Bob's characterization of her career because the truth was classified at levels he couldn't imagine. Emma was preparing to make her excuses and leave when the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the front driveway. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps it couldn't have been better, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. She glanced toward the side gate, wondering if another neighbor had decided to join Bob's impromptu lecture series on the superiority of military service over civilian careers. Heavy footsteps approached along the concrete pathway, deliberate and measured in a way that suggested military training. Emma felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the kind of hyper-awareness that years of intelligence work had taught her to trust. Something about those footsteps felt significant, though she couldn't yet identify why. Bob was mid-sentence, explaining to Frank the fundamental differences between military efficiency and government bureaucracy, when the gate latch clicked open. The problem with these civilian agencies, he was saying, is they don't understand accountability. No real consequences for failure, no genuine standards for performance. The man who stepped into the backyard commanded immediate attention without saying a word. He was tall, probably in his late 50s, with silver hair cut in a regulation style that suggested recent military service rather than nostalgic grooming. His civilian clothes couldn't disguise the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his eyes swept the gathered crowd with the kind of systematic assessment that spoke of professional training. Emma recognized him instantly, though she'd only seen him twice before, both times in secure briefing rooms where cell phones were surrendered at the door, and conversations were automatically classified. Sergeant Major David Chen, retired Special Forces, currently serving as senior liaison between military intelligence and civilian agencies. He was Bob's old Army buddy, but he was also one of the few people outside her immediate chain of command who knew exactly what Emma's job entailed. Well, I'll be damned, Bob said, his voice shifting from pontificating to genuine pleasure. David Chen, you old bastard. What brings you to my neck of the woods? Chen's smile was warm but controlled, the expression of someone comfortable with authority but cautious about revealing too much. Heard you were having a barbecue, Bob. Thought I'd swing by and see how retirement's treating you. The reunion unfolded with the ritualistic intensity that characterized meetings between old soldiers. Bob abandoned his post at the grill to embrace Chen with the kind of backslapping enthusiasm reserved for shared combat experiences. Frank and Uncle Tommy straightened unconsciously, their body language responding to Chen's presence, even though they'd never met him. Everyone, this is David Chen, Bob announced, his voice carrying obvious pride at being able to produce such an impressive guest. We served together in the 82nd. David here was one of the best NCOs in the Army, tough as nails and smart as hell. Chen accepted the introduction with practiced grace, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the assembled crowd. But Emma noticed that his attention kept drifting toward her, subtle glances that suggested recognition. She felt her pulse quicken as she realized the potential implications of his presence. David's working for the government now, Bob continued, apparently unaware of the irony given his recent commentary on civilian employment. Some kind of consulting work, right, David? Probably making twice what the army paid him to do half the work. Chen's smile didn't waver, but Emma caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Bob's characterization wasn't entirely accurate. Something like that, Bob. The transition to civilian work has been interesting. Jake stepped forward, his military bearing evident as he introduced himself with appropriate respect for Chen's former rank. The interaction was textbook military courtesy, polite but formal, acknowledging the hierarchy that transcended current service status. Marine Corps, right? Chen asked, noting Jake's posture and bearing. Yes, sir. Recently graduated from Paris Island. Outstanding. The Corps produces good Marines. Your family should be proud. The exchange was routine, professional, but Emma sensed Chen's attention fragmenting as he continued to glance in her direction. She wondered if he'd been briefed on her family situation, if he understood the delicate dynamics he'd walked into. Bob, energized by having a new audience for his military stories, launched into a detailed account of a training exercise he and Chen had participated in 20 years earlier. The story was entertaining, probably mostly accurate, and definitely calculated to demonstrate Bob's leadership capabilities to the assembled crowd. Emma's phone buzzed again, another encrypted message updating her on the developing crisis. The situation was escalating faster than initially projected, and her presence was becoming increasingly critical. She glanced at Chen, wondering if he was here on official business or if his appearance was purely coincidental. As Bob's story reached its climax, involving a night navigation exercise that had supposedly saved their unit from embarrassment, Chen nodded appreciatively while continuing to monitor Emma with peripheral vision. The attention was professional rather than personal, the kind of awareness that intelligence professionals maintained automatically. That sounds like classic Bob, Chen said when the story concluded. Always thinking 3 steps ahead, always finding solutions when everyone else saw problems. The praise hit its mark perfectly, inflating Bob's ego while establishing Chen's credibility as someone who understood real military leadership. Frank and Uncle Tommy nodded along enthusiastically, apparently convinced they were witnessing a meeting of genuine war heroes. Speaking of solutions, Bob said, apparently unable to resist steering the conversation back toward his favorite topic. We were just discussing the difference between military service and civilian careers, the work ethic, the sense of purpose, the willingness to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Emma caught a slight shift in his posture that suggested increased attention. That's an interesting topic, Bob. What conclusions did you reach? The question was perfectly pitched, inviting Bob to elaborate while revealing nothing about Chen's own opinions. Emma recognized the technique from her own training. Encouraged the target to keep talking while gathering intelligence about their thought processes and motivations. Well, Bob said, warming to his theme with renewed enthusiasm, I think there's a fundamental difference between people who choose real service and those who opt for comfortable government jobs. Take my daughter Emma here, for example. Emma felt the familiar sinking sensation as Bob's attention turned toward her again. But this time, with Chen watching, the stakes felt different. She wasn't just being embarrassed in front of family and neighbors. She was being professionally evaluated by someone who actually understood her work. Emma's got a nice, safe job with the government, Bob continued, apparently oblivious to the way Chen's entire demeanor had shifted. Regular hours, good benefits, no real risks or responsibilities. Very different from military service, where you're actually putting yourself on the line for your country. Chen's response was carefully measured, his voice carrying the kind of professional neutrality that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface. Government work can be quite varied, Bob. What kind of position does Emma hold? The question seemed innocent enough, but Emma recognized it as a probe. A gentle attempt to gather information while avoiding direct revelation. Chen was giving Bob an opportunity to demonstrate how little he actually knew about his daughter's career. Some kind of data analysis, Bob replied with dismissive vagueness. Risk assessment, she calls it. Basically sitting at a desk, reviewing reports, attending meetings. Important stuff, I'm sure, but not exactly what you'd call exciting or meaningful. Chen's poker face was impressive, but Emma caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested controlled reaction to Bob's characterization. She realized that Chen was probably familiar with her actual job responsibilities, possibly even her recent performance evaluations and security clearance level. Risk assessment can be quite complex, Chen said carefully. Depending on the scope and classification level, it might involve significant responsibility and expertise. Bob waved dismissively, apparently interpreting Chen's diplomatic response as polite skepticism. Oh, I'm sure it sounds impressive on paper. But let's be honest, how much real skill does it take to analyze spreadsheets and file reports? It's not like she's making life or death decisions or coordinating complex operations. The irony was so complete that Emma almost laughed despite her growing anxiety. Just that morning, she'd reviewed intelligence assessments that could influence military deployment decisions. Her analysis had been cited in briefing materials for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and her recommendations had directly affected operational planning for 3 different theaters. Chen's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the kind of practiced discretion that suggested secure communications. His expression remained neutral, but Emma noticed a subtle change in his body language that indicated the message's importance. "Excuse me for just a moment," Chen said politely, stepping away from the group to take what appeared to be a routine phone call. But Emma could hear fragments of the conversation, enough to recognize the terminology and urgency patterns of a crisis briefing. Chen was receiving the same kind of updates she'd been getting, probably regarding the same developing situation that had been escalating throughout the afternoon. When Chen returned to the group, his demeanor had shifted subtly. He was still friendly and professional, but there was an underlying tension that suggested competing priorities and time constraints. "Sorry about that," he said to Bob. "Work never really stops, even on weekends." "Tell me about it," Bob replied, though his experience of work interruptions was limited to occasional calls about neighborhood watch meetings. That's the problem with these government jobs. No clear boundaries between work and personal time. Emma's phone buzzed again, this time with a message marked with the highest priority designation. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach clench as she read the update. The situation had moved from developing crisis to active threat, requiring immediate coordination between multiple agencies and international partners. She looked up to find Chen watching her, his expression carefully neutral but his attention focused. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw recognition there, understanding of what the urgent communications meant and why her presence was becoming critical. "Bob," Chen said suddenly, his tone shifting to something more formal, "I have to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." The change in Chen's demeanor was dramatic enough to capture everyone's attention. Frank lowered his beer, Uncle Tommy stopped mid-gesture, and even Jake straightened noticeably. The casual barbecue atmosphere evaporated as Chen's command presence filled the space. "When you talk about meaningful work, about real service to your country, what exactly do you mean?" Chen's voice carried the weight of professional inquiry, no longer the casual conversation of old friends catching up. Bob blinked, apparently confused by the sudden shift in tone. "Well, I mean military service, obviously. Putting your life on the line, following orders, protecting American interests. Real sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. And you don't think civilian government work can involve that same level of sacrifice and service?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Bob glanced around the group, apparently seeking support for what had seemed like obvious truths just moments earlier. "I suppose some civilian jobs are important," Bob said carefully, sensing that he was being led somewhere he might not want to go. "But they're not the same as military service. Different levels of risk, different standards of accountability." Chen nodded slowly, as if considering Bob's answer with genuine interest. "That's an interesting perspective, Bob. Let me ask you another question. What would you say if I told you that someone in your immediate family was currently coordinating international security operations that directly affect American military personnel overseas?" The question hit like a physical blow. Bob's face went pale, his confident expression replaced by confusion and growing alarm. "What are you talking about, David? What would you say if I told you that person had security clearances higher than anything you held during your entire military career? That they regularly brief senior Pentagon officials on threats that could destabilize entire regions?" Emma felt the world shifting around her, the careful boundaries between her professional and personal lives beginning to collapse. Chen was moving toward revelation, though she wasn't sure whether his motivations were protective or punitive. "David, I don't understand what you're getting at," Bob said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that Emma had never heard before. Chen's attention turned to Emma, his expression serious but not unkind. "Emma, I believe you received several urgent communications this afternoon regarding the developing situation in Eastern Europe." It wasn't a question, and Emma realized that Chen's presence here wasn't coincidental. He'd come looking for her, probably after attempts to reach her through normal channels had been delayed by security protocols. "Yes, sir," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of discussing classified operations at a family barbecue. "The Joint Task Force requires your immediate input on the intelligence assessments. Your analysis of the communication intercepts has been specifically requested by the National Security Council." The words fell into the backyard like grenades, exploding the comfortable assumptions that had governed the afternoon's conversations. Bob stared at Emma as if seeing her for the first time, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. "I don't understand," Bob whispered, the words barely audible above the afternoon breeze. Chen's expression softened slightly, though his professional demeanor remained intact. "Bob, your daughter Emma isn't a data analyst. She's a senior intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her risk assessments aren't about budget shortfalls or administrative problems. She evaluates threats to national security and coordinates responses to international crises." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from the barbecue, visible and acrid and impossible to ignore. Frank's beer bottle slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete patio with a sharp crack. Uncle Tommy's mouth fell open, his usual jovial expression replaced by stunned disbelief. "The operation she coordinated last month prevented a terrorist attack on a NATO facility," Chen continued, his voice carrying the weight of classified truth being revealed under extraordinary circumstances. "Her analysis identified funding sources for 3 separate extremist organizations, leading to the disruption of their operational capabilities." Emma felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her professional identity was being dissected in front of people who lacked the context to understand it. But there was also relief in finally being seen, in having her actual contributions acknowledged by someone who understood their significance. 2 weeks ago, Chen said, his attention still focused on Bob, Emma briefed the Secretary of Defense on intelligence that directly influenced military deployment decisions affecting American troops in 2 different theaters. Her recommendations were incorporated into operational plans that are currently being executed by Special Forces units. Bob's face had gone from pale to ashen, his confident bearing replaced by the shell-shocked expression of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing in real time. "Yesterday," Chen continued relentlessly, "she identified a pattern in communication intercepts that revealed a planned attack on American diplomatic facilities. Her work prevented what intelligence agencies are calling a potential catastrophic event." The backyard had fallen completely silent, except for the distant sound of children playing in neighboring yards, their laughter, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the Martinez family gathering. Jake stepped forward slightly, his military training apparently helping him process the revelation faster than the civilians present. "Ma'am," he said formally, addressing Emma with the kind of respect reserved for senior officials. "I had no idea. Thank you for your service." The simple acknowledgement hit Emma harder than any of Chen's dramatic revelations. Jake understood, in a way that the others couldn't, what it meant to serve without recognition, to sacrifice without appreciation, to protect people who would never know your name. Chen glanced at his watch, the gesture reminding everyone that this wasn't just a social revelation but an active crisis requiring immediate attention. "Emma, we need to move on this situation. The secure conference call has been moved up to accommodate your input." Emma nodded, understanding that her personal drama would have to wait. There were genuine lives at stake, real decisions to be made, actual service to be performed. She stood, her movement automatic and professional, despite the emotional chaos swirling around her. "I have to go," she said simply, the words addressed to the group but her eyes on her father. Bob's voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. "Emma, I didn't know. I never knew." She paused at the gate, looking back at the man who had spent decades diminishing her achievements while remaining ignorant of their actual scope. There was pain in his expression now, but also something that might have been pride beginning to surface through the shock. "I know, Dad," she said quietly. That was the point. Chen followed her toward the driveway, but not before turning back to address the stunned gathering one final time. "For the record, Bob, your daughter is one of the most valuable intelligence assets this country has. The work she does keeps Americans safe in ways you'll never read about in newspapers or see recognized in ceremonies. She's exactly the kind of person who serves something bigger than herself, who makes genuine sacrifices for principles that matter." The drive to the secure facility was conducted in professional silence, both Emma and Chen understanding that the personal drama they'd left behind was secondary to the international crisis requiring their immediate attention. But as Emma reviewed the latest intelligence reports on her encrypted tablet, she couldn't shake the image of her father's face, the moment when decades of assumptions had crumbled in the space of a single conversation. The secure conference call lasted 3 hours, involving coordination with intelligence agencies across 4 continents, and requiring the kind of rapid-fire decision-making that Emma had been trained for but Bob had never imagined. Her analysis proved critical in preventing what would later be classified as a near miss that could have destabilized global security. When Emma finally returned home that evening, exhausted from managing an international crisis while processing the emotional fallout from her family revelation, she found a voicemail from her father waiting on her personal phone. "Emma," Bob's voice was hesitant, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. "I don't know what to say. I don't know how to apologize for 20 years of being wrong about everything that matters. Chen explained some things after you left, the things he was allowed to tell us. I still don't understand what you do, not really, but I understand that it's important. That you're important. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I love you, and I'm sorry." Emma saved the message, knowing she'd listen to it many times in the days to come. It wasn't perfect, wasn't a complete erasure of decades of dismissal and misunderstanding. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement that the daughter he'd underestimated had been serving her country with distinction while he'd been questioning her commitment to meaningful work. The next morning, Emma received a formal commendation for her role in preventing the international incident, though the details would remain classified for decades. That afternoon, she received a text message from Jake. "Ma'am, if you ever need anything at all, please let me know. Semper Fi." But the message that meant the most came from Bob himself. Simple and direct. "Barbecue next weekend. No speeches about military service. Just family." Emma smiled as she typed her response. "I'll be there, Dad. If work doesn't call." For the first time in her adult life, she believed he understood what that might mean. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.